Hello everyone, my name is Lowko and welcome to some more StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void. Today I want to be taking a little bit of time to talk about the Zerg vs Protoss matchup, as it is currently my absolute favorite matchup in the game. I think it's a blast to watch. In particular at the pro level, there are so many dynamic moves that are going on and so many tech switches that can make the matchups very interesting. Now, in the good old days of StarCraft 2, Wings of Liberty and Heart of the Swarm in particular, well, I say the good old days, but honestly, the game is so much better than it used to be in the past at this current stage. But anyways, in the good old days of StarCraft 2, it was the Zerg vs Terran matchup that really, was an absolute blast to watch. In particular at the pro scene, it seemed like all of the units that Zerg had would really get their playtime, and there were countless of different options of what the Zerg players could be going for. However, in the current stage of Zerg vs Zerg, I'm sure most of you are aware, a lot of the games are decided at the, the Ling-Bailing stage. And in Zerg vs Terran right now, it's a lot of Zerg players, turtling up, trying to get their Ultralisk and Brute Lords, then eventually moving out across the map. And while there are some dynamic moves that still do happen in Zerg vs Terran, and while it still definitely does have a lot of potential, I would say the Zerg vs Protoss matchup right now is by far the most fun to watch, together with Protoss vs Terran, which has been an absolute blast as well, as long as it's not like Adept Wars. But anyways, long story short, Zerg vs Protoss is a great matchup, and the reason for that is quite straightforward. You generally speaking have a lot of great moves. You've got a lot of, different fights. You got most of the time, like, multi-pronged aggression, like multiple attacks at different parts of the map, run-bys, warp-ins from the Protoss player on other stages of the maps. There's countless different cheeses that Protoss can go for, and yes, I know some of you may not enjoy that very much, but it does add to the dynamic of the game. And all in all, it seems like all of the Zerg units really do have their place, except for maybe the Swarm Host, but I'm still believing in that unit as well. I think it could very well have its use as well, and we can talk about that a little bit later on into this match as well, because there have been a couple of moments where in this game I was contemplating going for the Swarm Host, as there are definitely some moves where that can be very helpful. Anyhow, let's jump into it. So this is a game that I played, as you may have already noticed, right here during the celebration of the StarCraft 2 6-year anniversary. The game has already been out for 6 years, so that means that my drones are going to be carrying cake for a little while. And this is going to be one of the better Zerg vs Protoss games that I have played in a little while. I was very happy with how this game went. Whether or not I win or lose, I don't really care. As long as I feel like I've been playing well and I didn't make too many mistakes, generally speaking, I'm going to call that a win in my book, even if I'm losing some ladder points in exchange for it. Now, in this particular instance, you may have noticed, I'm gonna open up the production tab right here. My opponent decided to go for the double pylon block in both of my expansions, which is a little bit annoying, and it did put me behind, slightly as far as the, early game goes. But I decided to put down my Roach Warren and go for a handful of roaches with my very first Queen Inject popping off. I skipped out on Zerging speed, at least initially into the game, and the idea behind it is, if my opponent is spending a lot of resources in trying to do some, delaying of my own expansions, obviously he's also therefore delaying all of the units that he is going to be building, so I can probably do a little bit of work with the first set of roaches. And this is already a nice little dynamic that's not really possible in the other matchups. Generally speaking, if you're gonna be, falling behind in the early stage of the game of Zerg vs Terran, there are very little moves that you can do because, well, besides the Bailing Bust, which is basically like going completely all in, there aren't that many options. Now, in this particular instance, as you can see, I'm gonna be able to, at the very least, do some work to my opponent, and while I'm droning up behind this, obviously, I'm also getting the third base. So this is just a little bit of pressure where I'm trying to throw my opponent off after he is trying to throw me off of my own game as well. So this is the first little bit of dynamics, I suppose, that already make the matchup very cool in my opinion at the current stage. So obviously early on right here, my opponent was going for that pylon drop. I will be able to scout out with this little bit of roach aggression that indeed there is going to be a Stargate out on the map, and I'm gonna try and do as much damage here as possible. But in the meantime, I'm just droning up. I'm trying to get that economy out, because that is really what Zerg is trying to do in the early stages of the game. Splitting up one unit right here to kill the Stalker, trying to get whatever kills I can, just mostly delaying my opponent's tech. Now, I was hoping that there was gonna be like a cybernetics core here at the very front, right? Normally they put the cybernetics core at the front so I can delay their warp gate tech. Sadly, in this particular case, he ended up putting two gateways at the very front instead, which is an indication that he could potentially be going for some aggression a little bit later on as well. And it's indeed, we will see in this game, he is indeed going to be pressuring quite a little bit with the handful of gates. So it's a little bit of scouting information in exchange for a couple of probe kills, as well as, you know, some minor scouting here. I would have gone for the blind spores either way, and it turns out my opponent got in with the Oracle. He managed to get 2 worker kills, at least for the moment. So, you know, for the moment, that's totally acceptable for me. And I'm gonna be scouting with my next Overlord here as well to figure out whether or not he's gonna commit to all of this aggression with the Stargate, or if he's planning to switch into something like a robotics facility. Now, obviously, on the production tab, we can indeed see that he is going to go for the robotics facility as well as the Twilight Council, but at this point in time of me playing, I wasn't aware of that fact just yet. However, my goal for the moment is to just simply start teching up, get up to Hydralisk. Hydralisk are great as you can morph them into Lurker, and while roaches are very helpful in the earlier stages of the game, generally speaking, the closer you get to maxing out your supply, the weaker the the roach unit really becomes, as it's one of the least supply, or like the most supply heavy units. And therefore also one of the units that is pretty difficult to play. Now, as you can see, the Protoss players obviously also have got all kinds of different units that can really make the game a little bit scarier. And at this point in the game, as you can see, I did not end up making any kind of home defenses when I really should have. Generally speaking, it is an advice to always have at least 8 Zerglings with Zergling speed roaming the map so you can scout about, but more importantly, deal with 2 adepts. 8 Zerglings seems to be perfect for doing that task, and these units would not have done any kills whatsoever. And as you can see, in total, he ends up killing 9 workers here for me, or I guess 7 more after the Oracle shenanigans went down as well. And I could have completely prevented that just by going for a handful of Zerglings. So a little bit too aggressive by me, definitely did bite me in the ass a little bit, and it will come into play, as obviously those workers that I just ended up losing will need to be replaced. And you know, at that point, my army that I'm gonna be going for later on into the game is gonna be a little bit weaker, as I just have to respend those resources, but also lose the lost mining time that I could have had by having those workers alive. So long story short, I really should have had like a handful of Zerglings roaming the map to see what is going on. Now, I see he's still trying to produce something out of that starport. I couldn't see exactly what it was. We will find out shortly that it is indeed going to be Phoenixes. And while he's pressuring right here with the Void Ray, since it's only a single one, I'm not too worried for it. And since I was gonna go up for a bunch of Hydralisk here, I did feel like I was in an okay spot to begin with. Now, there is a bunch of Adepts once again trying to shade in to my third base. I will have to start making sure that I can deal with any kind of floods of Adepts if my opponent decides to make any more of them. Obviously, at this point in the game, I am not aware of the fact that he is actually not committing any more to this attack, at least for the time being. But it's time for us to start teching up. And one of the things you may have noticed here, if you have been paying very close attention, is that I have been going for the melee attack upgrade right here for the Zerglings. Now, obviously, that is an indication of late gameplay. Generally speaking, in the later stages of the match, that is really where that upgrade is going to shine. I actually make a bit of a mistake looking back at this. I went for the armor upgrades, which can be useful as well, but generally speaking, in Zerg vs Protoss, you want to be going for melee as well as missile, as the Carapace upgrade isn't all that useful. But long story short, though, I made a slight mistake here. Long story short, I'm trying to go up to that Hive Tech, and the reason for the Hive Tech is pretty straightforward. Both Ultralisk as well as Brute Lords benefit from the melee upgrades. Obviously, the little Brutelings that the Ultralisk or that the Brute Lords throw about do actually do impact damage, which get modified by the flyer attack upgrades for the Zerg flyer units. But more importantly, once they actually are on the ground, they turn into these little Brutelings that don't just do impact damage, but they also will get benefit from those melee upgrades. So I'm trying to tech up towards a higher tech army. On top of that, obviously, Zergling run-bys in the later stages of the game, once they get Adrenal Glands and +3 attack, are insane. So I'm trying to make sure that I start setting up for that later stage. However, that doesn't mean that I don't plan on going for any kind of aggression. Other than in Zerg vs Terran, you really need to make sure that the Protoss player, ideally speaking, does not max out. Protoss armies in general, once they are maxed out, are absolutely terrifying, and this is where I start moving across the map. With +2/+2 on the way and a lot of Hydralisk done, I just finished up the Hydralisk Muscular Augment as well, upgrade to make them, you know, a little bit more powerful, give them more movement speed and a little bit more range. I'm gonna start pushing across the map. At the same time, I'm already transitioning towards my next unit. Well, first and foremost, I'm morphing all of the leftover roaches into Ravagers, but more importantly, I am getting the Lurker Den right now as well, which is gonna be my next transition. So notice, right, early game was all about Lynx and Roaches. Now we're switching into Ravagers and Hydras instead, and very, very shortly, I will be switching into some Lurkers here as well. So these kind of fights right here are completely dominated by the player with better micro. If you manage to micro better than your opponent here, you can oftentimes pick up the victory, and I love that. That was something that we didn't really see in the Zerg versus any matchups really, other than Zerg versus Terran in the previous editions of StarCraft 2. When you were playing with Roaches, there wasn't a whole bunch of micro. You just sort of attack moved at the correct timing, and that was your main goal. Now you may notice here in the supply counts, there is a huge benefit for me. Currently it's 150 supply versus 110, which may be very much so in my favor, but generally speaking, that is not really going to be the case, as obviously Roaches are very supply heavy, and on top of that, Photon Overcharge can easily spell disaster as well as disruptors. So I'm trying to micro my ass off, but you will notice very shortly that I will start stacking up those minerals, because I'm spending all this time looking at my army, trying to dodge those disruptor shots, that I'm not making sure that I'm hitting all of the queen injects. Making some mistakes here. I'm not entirely sure where my queens are currently located, and I will indeed start taking a bunch of damage to these disruptors as well. Disruptors, extremely scary units. They blow up everything, and this is where I make a huge mistake. I start overextending with this army. I was smelling blood after dealing some economy damage early on. I was smelling blood. I was hoping to zone them away with my Lurkers, hoping that I could potentially pick up the victory right here. But the combination of the disruptor shots as well as solid micro on my opponent's end is just gonna be a little bit too much, and I end up losing far too much of my army here. Very, very shortly, you will see that my opponent is going to be able to clean up most of what I've got, and this is where I'm making a massive, massive mistake. First and foremost, I overextend, but secondly, I was not transitioning just yet. All of this time, I could have been teching up towards a hive. I could have been making drones for my fort base. I could have been getting my late game army out, right? Which I, at the beginning of this match, was focusing on. I was going for those mainly upgrades. I was trying to get towards a stronger army in the later stages of the game. And I just sort of, you know, got caught in the action. I got caught into the swing of things. And as you can see, the supply counts, even though they are heavily in my favor, you know, earlier because of the Roaches as well, but they definitely were slightly in my favor as well, just because of the sheer amount of army we had, has now been cleaned up and is even now an advantage for my opponent. We know we are both on 3 bases. I've got 57 Harvesters versus 57. He's going to be able to clean up that base that I just tried setting up. I'm trying to tech up desperately towards the hive, but I don't know how much he's going to be committing to this attack. I mean, there are all kinds of different moments where these disruptor balls can go into his advantage, but it looks like my opponent is playing it safe as well. He knows that, you know, at this point in the game, he is basically giving himself a lot of time if he doesn't attack, just because he can get whatever army units he wants. And he's going by, you know, he's trying to secure this by going for the fort expansion himself as well. He knows that right now I'm not going to be having the ability to really attack other than maybe a couple of Zerglings, as he just held back my huge amounts of aggression. And he knows definitely that I have been slowed down quite a bit by losing big chunks of my army. So instead of taking any risks, he decides to sit back himself. Now, at this current point in the game, he is definitely still at an advantage. But I'm trying to split, I'm trying to switch into my Hive Tech and go up to the Brute Lords. Brute Lords are beautiful units. Obviously, they're extremely powerful in Legacy of the Void. I love playing them, in particular in Zerg vs Protoss, but in Zerg vs Terran, I see a lot of use as well. And obviously, I could be going also for Ultralisk. Ultralisk are very good, but I'm a little worried that since I know that he's already got robotic facilities out, that he's just going to switch into heavy immortal play, which absolutely murder, you know, the Ultralisk. Now, Ultras definitely still have their place as well. Ultralisk do have a lot of use after, for example, going for the Brute Lords, forcing him to go for Stalker and Stargate units, at which point Ultralisk are going to be extremely powerful. But generally speaking, you would be, you know, looking to go for the Ultralisk Cavern after going for the Brute Lords. And for the moment, I am going for the Corruptors here as well. I know that he still got the Stargate out as well. We saw that earlier on into the game. We saw a couple of Void Rays too. I don't know how heavily he's committing into that. So I'm trying to scout about here, using my Zerglings for run-bys, trying to figure out what he's trying to do, and I'm just trying to make sure that I am at the very least, you know, keeping tabs of where his army is located, trying to see if there's any kinds of, you know, big army units moving across the map here, such as like Corruptor or for example Colossus, excuse me, that really will deal a substantial amount of damage. On top of that, I've been trying to improve my creep spread. Late stage or late game creep spread in Zerg vs Protoss is extremely important, as queens have a very big place on, you know, in the late game of Zerg vs Protoss, as you will be able to use them to transfuse your corruptors, to transfuse your brute lords, to transfuse your ultralisk, and to transfuse each other. Usually those are the kind of moves that you want to be going for. Now at this point in the game, the supply count is going to be you know, in my disadvantage, but I would say that since we are focusing on a roachless army, it may seem a little bit too far in his favor. However, my opponent does not call this the end of the game yet, as he is trying to move out. He wants to try and finish off this match, as he knows that I'm going to be relatively vulnerable. But because of all the creep spread, I have a ton of vision, and these lurkers are going to be allowed to deal the maximum amount of damage. I'm desperately trying to morph in all the brute lords. He's going for the disruptor hits. It takes 2 disruptor hits to kill a burrowed lurker. He knows of the positioning of them, but as soon as he sees the brute lords, he knows that this is going to be a very tough battle for him to fight. I mean, if you have a quick look at this Protoss army, yes, there are a bunch of Archons who can technically shoot up, and yes, there are going to be a bunch of Stalkers, but there's no way with the lurkers on the ground that he's going to be able to blink forward and try and get underneath the brute lords. So looks like we've dodged the bullet there. If I would have gone for Ultras, however, I think I would have lost the game straight up there. So generally speaking, if you're not certain what to go for in the later stages, try and get your brute lords above your lurkers and transition from there. Now, I'm trying to be smart here. I've noticed that all of the pro gamers in Zerg vs Protoss are playing relatively slow once they get at the disadvantage. They're not trying to overstay their welcome. They're just moving backwards, splitting up the army, and making sure that the Protoss attacks into them. And that's exactly what I'm trying to achieve here as well. I'm making sure that my brute lords are staying above my lurkers, or at the very least above the range of the lurkers, and I'm making sure that I'm zoning them to the best of my abilities. At the same time, here's something that I'm also trying to, you know, start trying to incorporate into my play more. I should have honestly been doing this in the battle, because honestly these Zerglings, while they do have the, you know, very nice upgrades, they're currently at +3 attack as well as Adrenal Clans. They're usually more helpful in, you know, the opponent's side of the map. In particular, once they are maxed out and they can't actually morph in any adepts, they're gonna be super powerful. Now, my opponent, in the meantime, is forced backwards because of these Zerglings. I'm trying to do as much damage here as possible as I can. Sadly, I cleaned up a couple of workers, and my opponent is using that cleaned up supply to warp in a few adepts and, you know, obviously ward away these Zerglings. And it used to be, or it turns out to be, a relatively helpful move for me that will allow me to clean up at least some of the army by just simply pushing them back and forcing them back home, which gives me, you know, the moment to start pushing onwards. I know that he's trying to secure the base here in the top right corner of the map, and I'm using my Corruptors here to go ahead and piss it down. We're using the Corruptors to piss it down, and I'm once again trying to get my lurkers underneath my brute lords, while trying to make sure that I am going to be able to deal with all kinds of incoming aggression, but I need to make sure that I'm at the very least allowed to move onwards here. Using my brute lords here on the high ground, while using my lurkers to ward away as much of this army as possible, but it looks like my opponent has had enough. I'm gonna have to micro these brute lords backwards at least slightly. There we go to the high ground, make sure that I'm not gonna be missing any kind of vision here, but my opponent has shaded all of his adepts away from this army. So while I'm pulling the queens here as well to try and deal with any kinds of, you know, incoming aggression and heal up the ultralisk, or the brute lords rather, as well as the corruptors, I need to make sure that I'm not losing all of my economy at home by using my Zerglings here and reinforcing with a couple of roaches just to try and get the maximum damage in. Now obviously, generally speaking, in the early stages of the game, Zerglings are pretty terrible against the adepts, but once they get +3 attack as well as the adrenal glands upgrade and you get these really solid upgrades, Zerglings actually become relatively useful, and we pick up a nice little lead once again. But it's not game over yet. As you can see, my opponent is aware of my mess Stargate, or my mess, you know, Brute Lord switch, and he is hoping that I'm gonna overextend here on the amount of Brute Lords that I'm making. Now, lucky for me, I've got my Corruptors out, but those Tempests are gonna start raining away at the damage that he can do at my Brute Lords. Now, lucky for me, I did bring the Queens over. I got no Queen Injects going down right now, which is generally speaking going to be alright at this point in the game, as you are going for the bigger tech units anyway. But I'm using my Corruptors here to try and zone away all of the Adepts that he has, and Tempest that he has, and at the same time I'm trying to deal with the aggression. Now, once again, not trying to overstay my welcome, but my opponent is forced to GG out of the match. Now, I love playing games like this. Whether or not it would have been a win or a loss, I always love playing these types of games, as they are so dynamic. I could have gone for Swarm Host at this point in the match, like, let's be real. If I would have had a handful of Swarm Hosts, say like 5 of them, raining in damage to his natural and potentially his third base, I mean, that would have done so much work. I could have gone for a switch to watch Ultras as well, after dealing with his, you know, with his, ground army, and noticing that he was going for the Tempest. I really shouldn't be morphing in any more Brute Lords anymore, because say if he's gonna be, you know, chrono boosting out like 3 Adepts or 3 Tempests at a time, I will definitely be losing those Brute Lords in a single hit very, very quickly. And even if I have Corruptors, they're not gonna be all that great. Instead, Ultralisks are going to be much faster. In combination with Zerglings, Tempests are gonna have a very hard time dealing with that. So there are all kinds of different you know, unit compositions that are viable in this matchup, and I think that Zerg vs Protoss is in a current stage of, you know, absolute awesomeness. Obviously, this could be changing in the future. We saw some crazy plays at some point with, you know, basically every Protoss going for the 2 base all-ins. And while I still do recommend Protoss players to go for the 2 base all-ins, these are my personal favorite Zerg vs Protoss games. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that like button down below, and if you want to see more content like this, do also make sure you hit that subscribe button so you get a notification as soon as I upload more. And other than that, I want to thank you all very much so for watching. Have an amazing day. Do not forget to smile, alright? And I will see you in the next one. Bye!